Hello and welcome to this short webinar hosted by Protexin Veterinary. My name is Gemma and I'm one of the veterinary technical advisors at Protexin. Today's topic is that gut feeling. So we all know that when we feel anxious we may recognise the feeling of butterflies, and today we're going to be thinking about that connection between the gut and the brain in our pets, in particular in dogs. So thinking about the gut and the microbiome when dealing with behavioural issues. As a bit of an overview of what we're going to talk about today, we're first going to look at the prevalence of anxiety and anxious behaviours in dogs, see how common it is, and then we're going to take a little look at the symptoms, including some of the milder symptoms that we might forget to look out for. We're then going to have a bit of a closer look at this gut-brain axis and what it actually entails, before moving on to look at Serenicare, our calming supplement. So how common is anxious behaviour? I would imagine the fact that you're watching this webinar means you may well have a dog with some sort of behavioural difficulty, and you are not alone, it's fair to say. So we look at a few examples here. There was a study done in 2020 in Finland of 13,700 dogs. Now that is really unusual for a veterinary study to have so many dogs looked at. But in this study they found that over 70% of owners were reporting that their dog showed some degree of anxious behaviour. In the same year, looking at dogs in the UK and Ireland, so 1,111 dogs, that's actually still quite a lot for a veterinary study, 35% of owners were reporting problematic behaviour in their dogs by the age of 9 months. Now it is worth pointing out both of these studies were published in March 2020, and that's published, so the data had been collected before that, so they are not influenced by COVID. And as vets in practice will be very aware, we know that behavioural difficulties have dramatically increased off the back of COVID for various different reasons. So they were the statistics before we even got to COVID. There then was a study looking specifically at pandemic puppies. This was carried out last year in 2024, and they actually reported that 31% of these puppies, which were taken on during the pandemic, were showing separation-related behaviours. And then finally, there was another study looking at 2,700 case records, looking at different types of behavioural conditions that had gone in to see behaviourists, and they found that about 70% of the dogs that were seen for behavioural problems were seen because of anxiety-related conditions. So when we think about anxious behaviours, we want to think about different signs that a dog may show that they're feeling anxious. So I think we're all fairly aware of some signs that can be seen, such as kind of biting, growling, lunging, these kind of things. But actually it is really important to also think about the more mild signs, because what tends to happen is that an animal will first show the mild signs, then they will start showing some more moderate signs before they get as far as showing severe signs. So if we can detect the animal is feeling a little anxious by keeping a good lookout for some of these more mild signs of anxiety, we can start to support them at this point before their behaviour starts to escalate and become more severe and potentially more dangerous or problematic for those around us. I have included the cat symptoms. I'm aware this is a talk to canine behaviourists and obviously people that follow their group. But some of you may well have cats, and it is worth pointing out that there are slightly different signs that we want to be looking at in cats versus dogs. But really subtle things like lip licking, yawning, tucking their tail between their legs, these kind of things which, a dog may sit in the waiting room of a vet's yawning and someone may think, oh, they're tired, when in fact actually that dog is showing that it is anxious. So perhaps we could offer it some support, we could go about things in a slightly different way to be able to enable it to feel comfortable in that situation and perhaps not feel anxious further down the line. Again, it's cat related, but just to highlight, if we do notice panting in cats, that is a veterinary emergency and they should be taken to the vets immediately. So we'll move on then to look at the gut-brain axis. So at Protexin Veterinary, we are experts in the microbiome in terms of research, education and how to support it. So we very much recognise the importance that the gut microbiome can play beyond the gastrointestinal tract itself and the interactions that the gut can have with various other body systems. And today we're going to focus in on looking at how the gut can interact with the brain. So when we're talking about the gut-brain axis, we're talking about the two-way communication that can happen between the gastrointestinal tract and the brain. So this can happen via various different pathways. and messages can be passed from the brain to the gut and similarly from the gut back to the brain again. So firstly, they can be passed along nerves using the nervous system. So various different nerves travel between the brain and the gut, and also we've got some nerves which travel just between different regions within the gut as well. We've then got the hormonal system. So we've got the hormones, are little chemical messengers which travel around the bloodstream, and we've got certain ones. For example, you may be familiar with cortisol, our stress hormone, which is released. We have various triggering hormones released from different parts of the brain, which set off the release of cortisol from the adrenal glands, and this can send messages directly to the gut, and also it can travel in the bloodstream and send messages back to the brain again. We've got the immune system, so depending what is detected within the gut, we've got special cells within the gut wall which have little tendrils that they put out into the lumen of the gut, and they can detect things that are coming along, passing through the gastrointestinal tract. If they detect something, for example, some sort of disease-causing bacteria that's problematic, they may trigger an immune response. We may get antibodies being released into the bloodstream, and these also can act as a messenger telling the brain what's going on or telling the body to react in a different way. We've got the neuroendocrine system, so quite a long word, but what this is talking about is little chemical messengers, so like the hormones, which are going to act on the end of nerves and send then messages along nerves. So for example, we've got serotonin, which you may be familiar with as our happy hormone, and it's something we'll come on to talk about a little bit more later during this talk. And then finally, we've got the microbiome. So when we talk about the microbiome, we're talking about the collection of living microorganisms that exist within a certain part of the body. So in particular here, we're talking about the gut microbiome, so all the microorganisms that exist within the gut. Primarily, we tend to think of bacteria, and they are the most prevalent microorganism, but there are also viruses, fungi, and protozoa as well. So these microorganisms are actually able to communicate with the body via several different ways, and in particular, they can also send messages to the gut. So we know, you may be familiar with the microbiome, you may have heard of things like probiotics and supporting good bacteria, trying to avoid bad bacteria within the gut. And we know that this is really important not only for gut health, but also for brain health too. So that nicely introduces us to the gut-brain microbiome axis. So we're adding another component here, not just thinking about the gut itself, but also the microbiome, these live microorganisms which exist within the gut, and how they can communicate with the brain. So the microbiome, these, well, primarily bacteria, but we know there are other things there as well, they produce chemical messengers. So some of these are the breakdown products when they digest fibre, but also they can be responsible for making these little chemical messengers which are able to bind to nerve endings and send messages along nerves. So these are known as neurotransmitters. And these can act locally within the gut wall, or they can act on the end of nerves. So they can send signals via the nervous system to the brain, or in fact can also be released into the bloodstream and can travel in the blood all the way to the brain as well. So these microorganisms within the gut can actually communicate directly with the brain. So in order to dig a little bit deeper into the involvement of the microbiome with regards to behavioural and brain conditions, we're going to look a bit at dysbiosis. So a dysbiosis is defined as an imbalance in the microorganisms that are present within the gut, and that could be that there are different microorganisms present to normal, or it could be that the populations have changed in terms of the numbers of bacteria present. And we know that there are some really strong links emerging between having a dysbiosis present within the gut and different behavioural and neurological conditions, as we can see on the right here. So this was a study that was carried out in people looking at the links between having a gut dysbiosis and having these different neurological dysfunctions. It's fair to say that there is still a lot of emerging research trying to work out exactly why having these changes in bacteria in the gut is linked to these differences that we see in terms of behavioural or neurological phenotypes. But we do know that if we have a dysbiosis, we tend to get disruption to the barrier function of the gut. So that means that things may be able to cross the gut lining that wouldn't normally be able to, and potentially they can then send messages to the brain in different ways. We know that dysbiosis can also interfere with immune function, so that's the body's ability to fight different infections. We know that certain microorganisms are important for making different neurotransmitters, and so if those microorganisms within the microbiome are less present, or there's less of them in terms of the number of them, then we're going to get less of that neurotransmitter being produced, which can have knock-on effects in terms of whatever it was that the neurotransmitter would have bound to. And we know essentially that by having a dysbiosis, we can then have an influence on brain function and behaviour as well. There is some evidence already emerging that's been published demonstrating the links between the microbiome in the gut and brain health in dogs. So in particular, there were some certain changes within the microbiome that have been noticed to be more common in dogs that were showing aggressive behaviours. And similarly, there's been a couple of studies published looking at 2 different probiotics which have been shown to reduce anxious behaviours in dogs and ameliorate signs of aggression and separation anxiety as well. Unfortunately, neither of these probiotic strains are licensed for use in the UK at the moment in terms of using them as live bacteria. So if we know that a dysbiosis or an imbalance in the microbiome is problematic, how can we think about or try and get an animal's microbiome back to being nice and balanced again, which we describe as being in a symbiotic state? There are various different ways that we can support our patients or our pets in this way. So we can do this by providing prebiotics. These are a food source for the beneficial bacteria in the gut. We can do it by providing probiotics. So these are live bacteria, which we know have been shown to provide a health benefit when provided in adequate amounts. We can also use postbiotics. So these are a fairly novel method and fairly recently discovered principle. So this is actually the act of giving inactivated or dead bacteria, and despite being dead, they still provide health benefits to the recipient. And this is because a lot of the reason that probiotics work, some of them are functions which require the bacteria to be alive, but there are other ways which the probiotic work which rely on different binding receptors on the outside of the cell, and these kind of properties are still present even if the cell is dead. So postbiotics can be really beneficial. It's a really exciting novel area that is definitely emerging within both the human and veterinary field. We can also think about doing fecal microbial transplantation. So this is taking the poo from a nice healthy dog and transplanting it into an unhealthy dog. This is something which is very much done under veterinary care, and at the moment there's only a few conditions for which this is indicated, which are primarily kind of chronic gastrointestinal conditions. And because the microbiome is so dependent on the animal as its host and as its habitat, whatever we are feeding the animal can alter the microbiome, because not only are we changing what food we're giving to the animal, we're changing what food we're giving to the bacteria within the gut as well. So by altering diet or lifestyle, perhaps reducing stress, because we know stress can be related to a dysbiosis, we can also influence the microbiome as well. In terms of thinking about Serenacare, we will focus in a little bit later on prebiotics and postbiotics, because these are both present to provide microbiome support within Serenacare. So that brings us really nicely on to Serenacare itself. So this is our calming support, and it's designed for both dogs and cats to help manage stress and anxiety. It contains a novel postbiotic blend, so we've just touched on postbiotics and we'll come back to them again when we look at the ingredients in more detail. It also contains alpha-casosipine, L-tryptophan, and as I said, it's designed to help manage stress and anxiety. It's got artificial chicken flavour, and it comes in a powdered form in sachets. In terms of more detailed look at the ingredients, we can see here per sachet we've got 300 milligrams of alpha-casosipine, 250 milligrams of L-tryptophan. So these are ingredients with direct calming properties. We'll see how they work in a minute. And then we've got our microbiome support in the form of pet biotics. So we provide a blend of postbiotics. As you can see here, there's 2 different bacterial strains, the Bifidobacterium longum and the Lacticacibacillus rhamnosus, both of which have been heat treated. And then we've got Fibersol, which is a prebiotic. I did mention already it's got an artificial chicken flavouring, so this contains no meat proteins whatsoever and is therefore suitable for animals even if they did have a sensitivity to chicken. So first we're going to look at alpha-casosipine or lactium. It actually is an ingredient in several human anxiety relieving and sleep products, and also another veterinary formulation as well. So what is it? It's a peptide protein molecule which is derived from the alpha S1 casein in cow's milk. It was actually discovered after scientists recognised that animals often become really drowsy and peaceful after they've had a good drink of milk. So they went off analysing the milk for different potential causes for this, and that was how they identified the alpha-casosipine. It's been shown to display anxiety reducing properties, and once they've looked into the mechanics of it, they've discovered that it actually binds to specific receptors in the brain. And for those of you that are scientifically inclined, it binds to the GABA A receptors. So these are receptors which GABA would normally bind to. And GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, so it kind of dampens down nerve responses. It's used by a third of all nerves within the brain and spinal cord. We know that it's really important in terms of controlling the response to stress and anxiety. And actually there are certain anxiety modulating drugs, so pharmaceuticals, that also target this receptor. Alpha-casosipine has been shown in dogs, cats, rodents and people to reduce stress and anxiety related behaviours, and in rodents and people it's also been shown to improve sleep. Might well improve sleep in dogs and cats as well, probably does, it just hasn't had the studies to definitively say that. So we then have our other calming ingredient, L-tryptophan. This is the sole precursor for the production of serotonin. Now you may have heard of serotonin before. It's often described as our happy hormone, and that's because it plays a really important role in regulating mood. Along with this, it also is really important in the process of understanding the sensation of reward and then learning something and being able to remember it. And it's also really important for sleep and other body processes too. Essentially, serotonin is just a little chemical messenger that can bind to the end of nerves and trigger certain responses. So L-tryptophan is required for the production of serotonin both within the gastrointestinal tract, and in fact 90% of the body's serotonin is made within the gut, and also for serotonin production in the brain. When we're really thinking about mood regulation and serotonin's role in mood regulation, we are thinking about serotonin within the brain. And so in order to make serotonin within the brain, the L-tryptophan needs to reach the brain. So it's taken up from the intestines, it enters the bloodstream, travels around in the bloodstream and it gets to the brain. Here it needs to cross a really tight barrier called the blood-brain barrier. And then it enters the brain where it can be made into serotonin. We know that if we increase levels of tryptophan circulating within the blood, we can increase the rate of serotonin synthesis within the brain. So by supplementing L-tryptophan, the aim is to have more available within the brain to be able to make more serotonin and support a normal mood in these animals. Given that important roles of serotonin include regulating mood, understanding sleep and stress, it's not surprising as the sole precursor of serotonin that tryptophan itself is thought to have properties in terms of regulating these things as well. And in fact it's been shown in various mammals, but in particular dogs is what we're thinking about today, to support normal behaviour as opposed to stress related and anxious behaviours. Whilst we're talking about tryptophan, this seems a good point to just mention the existence of serotonin syndrome. Now this isn't to scare anyone, but it is important that we are always aware of any potentials when we're using any sort of behavioural modifying product, and especially if using it alongside of other pharmaceuticals. So in people, the use of different medications or supplements which can increase levels of serotonin has been occasionally reported to cause something called serotonin syndrome, which is essentially an excessive release of serotonin. This condition has been very rarely reported in dogs and cats, and in fact it's not been reported due to them taking concurrent medications alongside of each other, but instead it's normally reported because they've got access to their humans' medications. However, it is important to just be aware of if we are using something containing L-tryptophan, which is a serotonin precursor, alongside of potentially other serotonergic medications. Different potential symptoms, really variable actually, from gastrointestinal to kind of more neurological signs depending on the severity, but those are the kind of things we might want to look out for. And I think if you were ever worried about using Serenacare alongside of another medication, always sensible to talk to your vet, talk to your behaviourist, but because it is a powdered formulation, you can always just do a very gradual start, starting with a small amount of the powder and gradually increasing to the full dose over several days to a week. If you are ever worried about whether you can use Serenicare specifically alongside of another medication, please just contact us using this email address here. We'll move on then to look at how Serenicare can support the microbiome. It does this in the form of petbiotics. Petbiotics are unique to Protexin, and they've been formulated to support the microbiome and therefore the gut's function and its interaction with the rest of the body. In particular today, we're obviously thinking about the interaction between the gastrointestinal tract, the microbiome and the brain. In terms of Serenicare, it contains prebiotics, so these are not broken down by the body itself, but instead they selectively feed and nourish the beneficial bacteria within the gut. It also contains postbiotics, so these remain bioactive despite being inactivated by heat treatment, and they provide health benefits to the recipient. So we'll go on and look at each of them in slightly more detail now. So as we saw earlier, the postbiotics present within Serenicare are this blend of Bifidobacterium longum and Lactis casei-bacillus rhamnosus, which have been heat treated. In combination, they've been shown to help modulate anxiety and support normal behaviour patterns. One of these studies was done in zebrafish. Sounds a little bit random, but actually it's a model which is used a huge amount in research, and in particular with regards to neurological and behavioural conditions, and the results were not dissimilar to certain anxiety modulating medications as well. On its own, the heat-treated Bifidobacterium longum has also been shown to support gut barrier function and reduce oxidative stress. And we know that supporting gut health is really important in terms of that gut-brain axis and all the communication going on between the gut and the brain at all times. This brings us on to our final ingredient, Fibersol. So Fibersol is a resistant starch. This means it's not going to be broken down by the dog itself in terms of its stomach acid or by its pancreatic enzymes, but instead it reaches the intestines where it acts as a food source for the beneficial bacteria and therefore is acting as a prebiotic. Fibersol is supported by 30 years of clinical research with over 100 studies demonstrating its performance. It's approved as a FOSHU ingredient, so this is a Japanese accreditation which identifies foods which contain ingredients which have officially proven health benefits. So in humans, it's been shown to support intestinal regularity and also maintaining postprandial glucose levels. So that's the sugar levels in the blood after eating. And finally, it was named as the best functional ingredient of the decade in the 2024 Gulf Food Manufacturing Industry Excellent Awards. So really nice ingredient to have in there, fantastic microbiome support that we're adding in alongside of the postbiotics. So we've learned all about Serenicare and how it works, what's in it, but when might we actually reach for it for our dogs? Serenicare is designed as a calming support to help both dogs and cats to manage stress and anxiety, and realistically it can be used in any dog or cat which has experienced stress and anxiety for any sort of reason. Some examples include if we've got animals which are particularly sensitive to noises, for example fireworks or thunderstorms, and that's not only using it in the run-up perhaps to fireworks time of year, but actually we can also use it during a desensitisation programme as well to support their learning. We can use it if we know there are stressful situations coming up, moving house, going to kennels or cattery, that kind of thing. We can use it in patients which have got general anxiety or more specifically separation anxiety, or if we've got a dog which is uncomfortable with unfamiliar people coming into the home as well. Directions for use are nice and easy, so just follow the dosing guidance here in the chart, that's also on the box. It's recommended to begin supplementation at least 2 weeks prior to any expected anxious event, obviously dosing as we see above, but we can give an additional dose 90 to 120 minutes before an expected event. So in particular, I guess if we know something is coming up, maybe firework time of year, something like that, a particular trip to the vet, before travel, that kind of thing, we can give an additional dose if we feel it's required. So it is suitable for long-term use, but we very much recommend using it alongside of appropriate behavioural training. In terms of Serenicare, it really is part of a multimodal approach that we may be thinking about using if we have got an animal with a behavioural condition. So using this to help get the animal in the right headspace alongside of doing behavioural modifications to get the best long-term effects. The The dose can be increased or decreased, they're best to do that with your vet's guidance. And it is worth pointing out that even though we recommend starting at 2 weeks prior to an anxious event, we know that the effects can continue to improve up to about 6 weeks. So if you're not sure if you think it's helping after 2 weeks, I would recommend giving the full 6 before you make that judgment call. It's worth noting, while we do recommend starting at 2 weeks ahead of an anxious event, there has been a study published just last year which showed that there were effects of alpha-casosipine within a couple of days. These were dogs which were given alpha-casosipine just for 2 days prior to going to a vet's, and they were reported to have significantly lower stress scores than those given a placebo. So we know that obviously the microbiome support is going to take longer to take effect, and the benefits will continue to be seen as we have a longer period of time of having taken it. However, if you don't have a 2 week window and you're needing some sort of calming support, it is still reasonable to try the Serenacare in this time frame, given this recent published evidence. Serenacare has been a great hit both with pet owners and vets alike. Prior to launching it, we carried out an owner trial through the Home Tester Club. These were owners of anxious dogs, and they were provided with 6 weeks worth of Serenacare to try in their pets. As you can see here, nearly 90% of the owners felt that they would recommend Serenacare to their friends and family at the end of this trial period, with 67% agreeing that their pet's nervousness significantly improved after using Serenacare, and 70% agreeing that their pet felt more calm. They were all dogs, the pets that were taken. Loads and loads of 5-star reviews as well, so really positive response out in the field as well. Whilst the Home Tester Club was carried out solely using Serenacare without any behavioural modification, we do very much promote a multimodal approach, so the use of Serenacare alongside of behavioural modification. So Serenacare obviously works in 2 different ways. It works through supporting the microbiome and therefore the gut-brain microbiome axis, and it also provides direct calming effects through the inclusion of L-tryptophan and alpha-casosipine. Obviously, if we're doing behavioural support, we want to be doing things like teaching coping strategies whilst the animal is in a positive headspace, and doing things like gentle desensitisation. We know that Serenacare has this calming effect, and also we know that if you're calm, you're in a better place to be learning, and therefore it can have a really positive knock-on effect in terms of the behavioural training. So that brings us to the end of our talk today, and we'll just summarise with Serenacare, reminding you that it is a calming support designed for dogs and cats to help manage stress and anxiety, and it really is for use alongside appropriate behavioural modification to support new coping strategies. That's me all done for now, so if you did want the references from any of the studies quoted, feel free to get in touch with us, or if you've got any other questions, then the email address is here, technical@protexin.com. Thank you very much. Goodbye.